We were actually not planning on having a commission meeting today. So Commissioner Jenkins happens to be out of the country, otherwise I'm sure he would be joining us today. So any votes that we will be taking will be 4-0, which will count as unanimous under the circumstances. We have a staff update, but we also have several members, elected officials and members of state organizations that I'd like to recognize first, and then have a couple of them speak because they have other places that they'll need to be going this morning. After their comments, we will have a staff's presentation prior to public comment. This way the public can hear the staff's presentation and then have an opportunity to comment anything that they would like to say or respond to the staff presentation. The reason I'm doing it that way is traditionally we do not allow 2 bites of the apple, if you will, make a public comment and then make an additional comment. And since we're only having the single agenda item, I figured that that would be appropriate. We are pleased to have with us this morning our Congressman Brian Mast. Sir, welcome. The Florida Senate is well represented this morning. Senator Rubio's office is represented by our good friend Greg Langowski. How are you, sir? Senator Nelson's office, we have a new face. For many years, Michelle McGovern has been the regional or district director for Senator Nelson. She has been promoted to statewide, which is a great opportunity for her. And she has, I don't know if you're wearing her shoes, but you're filling them. Mr. Sean Hall, welcome, sir. We've been very well represented in this area in the Florida Senate by Joe Negron, and he is very well represented today by Carrie Lira. Carrie, welcome. We also have the DEP Deputy Secretary. Sir, we're happy to have you, Mr. Drew Bartlett. Welcome. And the DEP District Director, Ms. Jennifer Smith. Jennifer, welcome. From the city of Estuary, I know that we have Ben Hograth here. Sir, welcome. We appreciate it. And then I'm very happy in this area. He doesn't need any recognition or, well, he gets plenty of recognition. He doesn't need any introduction. Mr. Mark Perry from the Florida Ocean Grid. Now, I will tell you that as I look out into the gallery here, as my colleagues do, there are many very familiar faces in the battle that we've been battling for many years. Some of you are river warriors, and warriors is probably the right word. I'm not going to try to pick you all out, but I would tell you that there are dozens of people that have been at this nonstop, full-time for many, many years, and we appreciate your efforts every day, but we appreciate that you came out this morning to make this, to hear our presentation. I think the severity of the issue warrants this list of elected officials and their representatives. Commissioner Hurd had called for this meeting. I appreciate that. Information is basically the only tool we're really having to deal with lately, and I think the more information that we have, the better equipped we are to continue the fight. So we appreciate that, Commissioner Hurd. Thank you. We will start with our comments this morning from Congressman Brian Mast. Sir, welcome.
Thank you for having me this morning. I would certainly echo your comments. The support of everybody, both in this body and everybody behind us, is what makes it possible for us to go out there and not just have this fight, but have the ability to go out there and win this fight. The advocacy at every single level, it matters, and it matters for me in the work that we do in Washington. To give everybody a brief update on the first 8 months of this year, and then what we have coming up in the very short term, this is what's going on. In the first 8 months of this year, there has now been a full appropriation, every dollar that is needed to bring the Herbert Hoover Dike restoration to completion, between $561 million authorized recently out of an emergency disaster declaration that just came through from the administration, as well as the 2019 appropriations. That is the full appropriation to bring that dike from the federal cost share to completion. Recently, we passed the Water Resources and Development Act through the House of Representatives. This still has to be married with the Senate version of the bill, but in the House version of this bill, the reservoir south of Lake Okeechobee has been approved to move forward in the House version. We anticipate getting that into the Senate version as well. Also in that same bill, the Water Resources and Development Act, we put in a provision to begin redoing the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule beginning in 2019. This is very similar to any other NEPA process out there. It does take a couple of years to do, but this process will begin, as long as we can get this through on the Senate side again, beginning in 2019. Now, looking forward to what's going on in the very immediate near term. On July 25th, we had a meeting of the Everglades Restoration Task Force in Washington, D.C. It was put on by the Department of the Interior. Ms. Combs is the chair of that. Ms. Combs, as well as everybody else that was in attendance for that meeting on July 25th, everybody ranging from the Miccosukee and the Seminole tribes to municipalities on the west coast of Florida, those that represent agriculture, those that represent environmental entities, South Florida Water Management District, and a number of other entities that were all on hand. They will be coming here to Stuart on August 17th. On that July 25th meeting, they made an offer to come down here and have a conversation based on one single issue. And this issue is, can we keep Lake Okeechobee at a lower level during dry months instead of trying to keep it at an elevated level during dry months, so that when we do hit the more wet months, the rainy seasons, May, June, July, August, they're ahead of the game and they don't have to destroy our communities. That is the entire purpose of this meeting that we will have on August 17th. Again, it was intended to be had on August 10th. The reason that we moved it to August 17th is because we will be getting a new head of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for our region here. That new head of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers will be able to be present on the 17th. So they requested that we move that to the 17th. That's why we moved it to the 17th. That will be at the Flagler Center, right next to my office there, here in downtown Stuart, so everybody can anticipate that. We do have commitments from people coming over from the West Coast as well, those municipalities. And this is something that I think we can all work together on, putting everything we have into this. That's why I'm going to work on it, saying, listen, this doesn't cost anybody a dollar. This is something that Ernie Marks, the head of the South Florida Water Management District, testified to everybody in that hearing on July 25th, saying it doesn't matter to him how low Lake Okeechobee gets. Doesn't matter if Lake Okeechobee is down at 10 feet or 9 feet or 8 feet or 7 feet. He's still going to say they need to send everybody that wants water off of Lake Okeechobee the water that they want. So if that is what the head of the South Florida Water Management District can acknowledge, then it is absolutely fair and it is absolutely right to the communities that are affected, ours, those communities on the West Coast, that they make an effort to keep that lake as low as they can during those dry months, so they don't have these discharges during the wet months, which is what we see year after year. Again, it doesn't cost a dime, and I hope to have the support of everybody present to go out there and have this fight. That's the update that I have for you this morning from everything going on in Washington, D.C. If you have any questions for me, I'm more than happy to answer them. If you don't, I'm more than happy to get out of your hair.
Congressman, thank you very much. We appreciate your efforts. I know that concept of keeping the lake levels lower is something that you've been pushing successfully, and I appreciate it because it seems like a logical solution to me as a layperson. It doesn't have a cost, multi-billion-dollar cost attached to it, and it just makes logical sense. So good for you for bringing that forward. I think that when we look at what our options are, I think it needs to be all of the above. Commissioner Hurd.
Yes. Thank you for all your efforts. Another one of the federal challenges is the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule is dependent upon water supply and flood control, and needs it also to prioritize health and human safety.
Yes.
And that currently is not part of the consideration for prioritizing how the lake level, how the lake is discharged. So how do we go about changing that so that we manage water in a completely different way?
So there are a couple of ways. Two ways that we've looked at doing this. One of this is going back to the original charter for what goes on with managing flood control and everything else, from being able to navigate Lake Okeechobee, everything dating back to the 1940s, and changing that original piece of legislation in Washington, D.C. That's not going to be a tact that works in Washington, D.C., just to be very blunt about it. That's not something that's going to happen, to go back and change a piece of legislation from the 1940s. It hasn't been done. It's not going to occur. What we have proposed in Washington is essentially setting up a charter to basically supersede those charters that already exist. One that would include health and human safety as something that needs to be included in this fight. Now, to that point, one of I think the most important things to note about this entire conversation is everybody in this room has been told year after year that this water management is about risk management. Risk management for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the risk of people dying south of Lake Okeechobee if that dike were to breach. Now, risk management is something that can be calculated very simply. Less water on Lake Okeechobee equals less risk of dike failure. But the dike and the lake is not being managed for risk. It is being managed for benefit of a number of different entities. And as members of this community, we can't allow ourselves to be told that it's risk management, risk management. That's why we don't get to say so. That's why we keep getting all of the discharge that we do year after year. That's not the truth, and we can't acknowledge that as the truth, and we can't allow anybody else to get away with saying that's the truth. They know that they keep water on the lake for all of these other purposes, whether it's recharging the aquifers for drinking water at Miami-Dade, whether it's recharging the stormwater treatment areas, whether it's water that the Miccosukee and the Seminole tribes are given basically through a treaty, whether it's the water that different municipalities drink, whether it's the water that agriculture uses for irrigation. All of that water is kept on there for them, for benefit, to our detriment, and we need to hold the Corps and South Florida Water Management accountable to that, to say, you're not managing on health and human safety, you're not managing based on risk, you are managing for benefit of others to the detriment of us. And that needs to stop.
Speaking of risk, I'm concerned about testing that's being done, both in Lake Okeechobee and here, and it seems that there are different standards that the state has and different standards that the EPA and the Center for Disease Control has. And I want to make sure that we are measuring risk properly. And I'm not saying, I'm not slamming the DEP. You have your way of testing, but I think that we need to be cooperating with the federal and state agencies in order to really test properly. We hear that when Lake Okeechobee was covered by 90% algae blooms, we were told that there was no significant health risk. Is that accurate? I don't know, but I think we need to coordinate testing so that we're making sure that we are assessing risk and alerting people about the risk that they might be putting themselves to. So I think we need to have federal testing also in coordination with our state testing.
Commissioner, there's an old saying, right? I might have been born in the dark, but it wasn't yesterday. I think any of us with a lick of sense can say that there are absolutely health risks to the water that they're sending our way, or the water that's, whether it just sits in the middle of Lake Okeechobee. One of the things that we've done federally, we just introduced a bill. There is Senate partnership with this bill. This is a bill that's been worked on for a long time. It's known as HABARCA, Hypoxia, and Harmful Algal Bloom Research Act is what that's all about. And that very specifically loops in NOAA and the EPA, requires them not just to do testing on this water, but actually give the empirical data to say what most of us probably already know, but to actually say to the federal government, this is exactly why they're getting these algal blooms on Lake Okeechobee, why they're getting sent to other places. These are the sources of it. The federal government has not taken the time to go out there and point out a point source pollution for what causes this, and this is essentially a demand that NOAA and the EPA go out there and do that, and it also gives them the authority to go out there and respond to those harmful algal blooms as well. So that's something going on that front.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Commissioner Hurd. Any other questions for the Congressman?
We certainly appreciate your being here. My perception over the years is once the water gets into the lake and it does get to the point of emergency, there's only one answer, and that's the estuaries. And so because there's not sufficient conveyance to get it south, we did have one year where they were able to accomplish that. But it's conveyance and it's contamination. So the waters aren't acceptable going south, and if we could prevent it, we would prevent it, but we don't have that luxury. So those, in my perception, are the areas of difficulty, and we need to move some of our activity up north of the lake in order to intercept more of that volume. That's how I would see. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. And to that point, one of the things we didn't discuss was that the Kissimmee River restoration is nearing its completion, and further south, the raising of the Tamiami Trail, bridging that so it's not just culverts for the water to flow through. That is also seeing itself to completion. These are things, projects that are fully funded, that as they come online, both create less water flowing into Lake Okeechobee and allow more water to flow to the south, south of Lake Okeechobee. That's important. But I would just reiterate this. We have an opportunity to say, not one drop headed our way. Appropriate, proper management of Lake Okeechobee, where they don't manage for the benefit of everybody, but they do manage truly based upon risk, allows them to keep less water on the lake and not harm our communities. We all know that this is a game of inches, a game of feet. If the Corps of Engineers and South Florida Water Management District would get ahead of the schedule in the dry season, let more water evaporate off of Lake Okeechobee, let more water head into other directions besides the east and west coast of Florida, then they wouldn't have to send us this water come June 1, July 1, August 1, whenever they start to get the rains that necessitate this. They can prevent this from happening again, and it needs to happen immediately.
Thank you very much. Any other questions for the Congressman? Yes, Commissioner Smith, I apologize.
Congressman, thank you. And again, thank you for showing up at the Eco Task Force meeting. For those of you who didn't watch it or didn't see the video, our congressman showed up when a lot of others didn't. We had staffs and so on and so forth there, but our congressman showed up. And not only showed up, but really put a lot of things on the record that needed to be on the record, which also facilitated his final question about the meeting coming up in 2 weeks or 3 weeks on the 17th that will be held here in Estuary, which was no small task. You know, sometimes these things happen, and we all show up and we do our thing and we comment and we do what's needed. But what makes them happen are people that actually get engaged and participate. And Congressman, thank you for that. That is a huge issue, and it's a huge opportunity for us to fully engage and get the lower schedule better for us. And had that not happened, this meeting on the 17th wouldn't be happening. So, Congressman, thank you very much for your efforts. Thank you for always showing up, and thank you for everything you do for us.
Yes, sir. Appreciate you all having me this morning.
Congressman, thank you very much.
Take care.
Okay, our next presentation this morning will be from the DEP Deputy Secretary, Mr. Drew Bartlett. Mr. Bartlett, good morning, sir. You are recognized.
Good morning, Chairman. Thank you for having me here. I am here to answer any of your questions. Commissioner Hurd, if you have questions about the sampling, I'm here to answer it. This is a serious issue for the state. The health effects are serious. We certainly advise if you see algae or scum or floating mats on the water, stay away, do not get in the water. So this is something that has me, I've been in public service for 29 years. Working with the environment, first at EPA and now here at Department of Environmental Protection, is something that I take very seriously. I don't sleep at night when these things are happening. And so after arriving here last night at 9:30, I just read all the materials and I'm here to answer any questions you have. So I just want you to get on with your public meeting, and I'll be here, right here, to answer.
Stay right there, sir. Commissioner Smith.
Again, back to the same meeting in D.C. With the South Florida Eco Task Force. Drew ended up chairing the meeting when the Secretary needed to leave. And again, what's incredibly important about the fact that we have our people, our Florida people, sitting at the table, taking what needs to be taken and talking about what needs to be talked about. Drew, thank you. And you know, a lot of people want to blame a lot of people for a lot of things. But at the end of the day, you still have to have people that are willing to engage and willing to have people that are willing to participate and get it better. And then just, it's more of a thank you for all that you guys are doing and continue to do. That group of people, there are 14 members of the board, correct?
That's correct.
14. You had people there from every corner of every piece of this issue that needed to be there. And again, having the congressman there and showing up and sort of challenging, I guess, the board, but also putting this into perspective and having it come back here to Stewart is super important. And thank you for being part of that and helping us get to a better place. Thanks.
Commissioner Hurd?
Yes. What protocols does the DEP use for algae bloom testing?
Great question, Commissioner, and I can't tell you the codes and the protocols, but this is why we test the way we test. First of all, our public message, whether it's on Lake Okeechobee, St.Lucie, Caloosahatchee, is stay away from the algae. You know, do not recreate in the algae, because we don't know whether that algae is producing toxins at the time you are recreating. So when we go out and test, what we need to understand is, are the algae producing toxins? And they're getting into the waterway where people may not be swimming through algae, right? And so what we do is we test around it, where we're telling people, that you should not swim in the algae, but if they happen to swim next to it, we need to know whether they're producing toxins. And so we sample in the waterway itself where people could be recreating, to be able to advise whether they're producing toxins or not. If we sample the actual algae itself, just through the laboratory methods, it's going to show up with toxins, because we're sampling and digesting the algae in the laboratory. And so that doesn't tell us, whether there's toxins that they are producing in the natural environment. So it's important for us to be able to tell in the waterways where people might be recreating whether there's toxins being produced or not. So we sample, we analyze, and we post on the website as soon as possible and let the Department of Health know as soon as possible.
I'm concerned that people aren't recognizing the risks. I've read news reports from Okeechobee that the people there say that the algae doesn't become toxic until it's discharged into the seawater. And that's worrisome, because it doesn't. I can't believe that that's true. I have to believe that it's toxic when it's in Lake Okeechobee too, and that people aren't being told that it's toxic, and therefore aren't taking the precautions that they should be taking.
Commissioner, our message is clear. Microcystis is a toxin-producing algae. You should not recreate in microcystis.
Also, we see that blooms, and they're putrid, and they smell. They're extremely visible. But what about the toxins that are invisible? They die, they settle into the sediments, and then they're recycled into the fish populations. And man, I don't think what do we do? What are you doing in order to analyze those effects? About the algae bloom hits the water, dies, sinks, gets into the sediment. Then it accumulates in the fish population, and it accumulates in the seagrasses. What's being done in order to learn the risks of those poisons?
It is an ongoing monitoring activity. We fund ourselves. We monitor all of our waterways routinely. We fund Orca, we fund Harbor Branch to get a better understanding of microcystis. I remember when I came down to the department 11 years ago, and I walked into the lab and I saw beakers upon beakers of green water. What is that? That's microcystis. We're trying to figure out what happens when it produces toxins, that type of stuff. I understand Mode is researching that as well. There's a lot going on to try to understand what's happening. The one thing we do know is when the blooms dissipate and they go away, and we continue monitoring, the microcystin toxin also goes away. And the theory we're researching is that there are bacteria that degrade it and eat it. Works for them. So we don't see it in the water column. After that, and from what I've read, we're not seeing it in fish tissue. If you're eating fish fillets, we're not seeing it in that either. Although that research needs to continue.
Thank you.
Thank you. Question for you on a more of a statewide level. We here for a long, long time have had the mantra of send it south. But as stewards of the environment, our community, and sort of good neighbors for our neighbors to the south, we don't think about just flushing the water south in any condition that it happens to be. We know that if it gets to the Everglades in bad condition, we've heard a national treasure. I believe that in Orlando, they also have the same mantra of send the water south. But there's no concern about what condition it's in when it heads south. And I know that when we talk about these issues, some of them are very expensive fixes. The C-44 reservoir needs to have a canal from the C-23, and we talk about dollar amounts with a B in billions than an M in millions. I don't know if our neighbors, and I don't necessarily mean St. Lucie County to the north, but I don't know if our neighbors to the north have the same concerns that we have. Florida's obviously flat, but it's got a little southern pitch. So I wonder if they have these meetings in Orlando and in communities north of here, if they have the same concerns, if their summers are ruined. And as a member, as the Deputy Secretary of the DEP, can you give us some insight on what's happening up in those areas? Are they spending hundreds of millions of dollars of their taxpayer money to affect fixes as we are here?
Good question, Commissioner. So when we worked on the Lake Okeechobee Basin Management Action Plan, we reached all the way up to the headwaters in Kissimmee. And we said, all right, governments, you need to do your part. You need to implement reductions, whether that's wastewater discharges, septic discharges, stormwater discharges, to protect Lake Okeechobee. In their immediate vicinity is the Upper Kissimmee chain of lakes, Lake Toho, Lake Kissimmee, Lake Cypress. Those are lakes that need work. And so we are hosting meetings up there to get them to do what they need to protect not only those lakes, but Lake Okeechobee. I would tell you that investment in the entire Lake Okeechobee watershed is necessary because for Senator Negron has been very generous in making sure we get appropriations to build projects north of Lake Okeechobee, like the stormwater treatment area at Taylor Creek and Nubbard Slough. I think in the board meeting this week, we're signing a contract to do a public-private partnership called Brighton Valley and Lakes to capture, treat water before it gets to the lake, in addition to all the best management practices and cost share retrofits we're doing in the watershed. A lot needs to happen in that watershed, don't get me wrong. There's a long way to go to try to get Lake Okeechobee cleaner. And that's something we've continued to invest in, we will continue to invest in. Moving water south, that is an investment that this state has taken tremendous leadership in making that happen. The appropriations that we're getting at the state level are unprecedented. Over $264 million is put in Legacy Florida to get dedicated funding. When we notice that we have that kind of commitment from the state, we start taking pieces of sending the water south off of the Corps ledger and sticking it on our ledger. And just this week at the board meeting, they're signing a contract to further open up Tamiami Trail down in the south to move more water south so that we can continue to pull water from the lake, treat it, and send it south. So there's a lot of investment going on in the state, and that just absolutely needs to continue.
Thank you. One other quick question for small businesses that have been affected here in our area. I had the opportunity recently to be with the Secretary of the DEP. He had come to Florida Oceanographic for a meeting and a tour. And as a small business owner, having had that in my history, I know that in the past when we've had these lost summers, there were loans available to small businesses. But I've heard from many that a loan is really not the answer, because if your business is struggling, a loan doesn't help you because you obviously have to pay it back. I know that the Secretary, when the governor had declared a state of emergency, that opens up funding. Can you give us an idea, and the folks that might be listening, struggling with their small businesses, what resources are available, and we know that they can contact us here at the county, but is there a website or a telephone number, or any contact information you can offer for businesses that one lost summer is the end?
Commissioner, I'm sorry, I do not have that because that program gets run through a different agency. So let me get it to your staff so that you can post it on your website.
That would be great.
That'd be fine. I know that you are here to talk about money that we have available to try to clean the algae out, to mitigate the problem and maybe, help those businesses with that. But, that's something for you to decide.
That's fair, thank you. A couple more lights for you, sir. Commissioner Hirsch?
Yes, our waterways are toxic again.
Yes.
So best management practices are not working. They're not even beginning to address the problem. So what is the water quality is the state's problem. And you have to create the state's solution. So what's being done to beef up mandatory regulations north of the lake so that they can't send contaminated water south?
This is something we have to work very closely with the Department of Agriculture on to get their best management practices implemented. I can tell you in the last 5 years, we did a concerted effort north of the Lake Okeechobee and all the basins that surround Lake Okeechobee to make sure that all those best management practices are implemented and are certified, and where the Department of Agriculture identified operators that were not implementing them, they sent them to us. We sent them compliance letters. They came into compliance. So that is just an ongoing effort. What we're asking for is not just regular best management practices, but also cost sharing, tailwater recovery, keeping the water on the growers' lands, deploying that across the watershed in combination with stormwater treatment areas, in combination with public-private partnerships, and in combination with the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan. But you're going to need all those things to make sure that water coming in Lake Okeechobee is clean.
Also, in 2014, voters overwhelmingly approved Amendment 1 in order to buy land, and the state's requirement for SERP is the state has to buy the land, and we have seen very little effort to spend Amendment 1 money on land. So is that going to change in Tallahassee? Or are we going to continue spending those proceeds on things that are not at all what the voters expected when we voted for Amendment 1?
So, Commissioner, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, the Northern Everglades Protection Program, I think everyone would agree that investment in those are critical and necessary to have clean water in South Florida, to have the water going where it needs to go, when it needs to go. Senator Negron did a fabulous job setting up Legacy Florida using Amendment 1 dollars that resulted in acquiring additional land. We have funded additional land acquisition to make sure Kissimmee gets completed, to make sure that the Upper Kissimmee Chain of Lakes project gets completed, and even to buy land in this county itself, in the IRL South. So those investments are happening. We are depending on the Corps of Engineers to finish the Lake Okeechobee planning project so that we know the footprint of lands that are necessary in Lake Okeechobee to acquire, so then we can start making those investments.
And what efforts are being made to purchase lands to complete IRL South? Because there's still a lot of land that's required, and that was passed in the 2007 Word bill. So I don't want to leapfrog over IRL South projects because we have new projects. Because if all those projects, the newer projects, SEP, the EA reservoir, were all modeled with IRL being finished first. So we're not going to receive the benefits that were promised us if you leapfrog over IRL South projects. So we need to continue acquiring land. What steps are being made to acquire the lands necessary to complete IRL South?
So I know that we have been working with the Corps of Engineers to make sure the planning for the C23, C24, and C25 projects does get completed. I think the Corps ran into complications with those projects, But the district is certainly engaged in trying to make sure those planning efforts go forward on an expedited fashion.
We need the land first, and that's why we passed Amendment 1. Thanks.
Thank you. Commissioner Fielder?
But we are glad you're here, Jim. And you're very, very helpful in your explanations. I think one of the underlying realities is the water can come in at least 6 times faster than we can provide for its exit. And that is a reality that I find disconcerting, because in the Lowe's Lake Okeechobee watershed activity, what we continued to do, to my terrible frustration, was to continually ratchet down the amount of land that we anticipated making available to hold water, either reservoir or whatever means we were going to use. And we just kept knocking I started pushing million plus acres of acre feet water storage. And we kept, what we've eventually knocked it down to is about 350, I think, which is just somebody's just being willing to not accept reality, I guess. If we had gotten the Texas storm instead of the Irma storm, really most of this conversation would be over. The dike would have been broken, it would have flooded past Boca Raton. I mean, the whole thing would have been, but why we don't want to recognize that is a probability, there is a probability that will happen. That's extremely disturbing to me. So I would encourage us to revisit, even though we've not quite even finished up with the Lowe's Lake Okeechobee watershed observations, so that we go back and say, yeah, if we do deep well injections, or if we do the aqua storage and recovery, those have utility to an extent, but they are very long. They take a long time. You're not going to defer a flood. You're going to deal with, as the congressman was saying, let's make summer times less traumatic. And that might be ways to do that. But it's not ways to deal with this enormous rain squall in the Orlando Basin. It's not ways to do that. And so we're using that as a method of explaining why we're not making provisions that will really solve the problem. And so that's my perspective on it. I'm disturbed, and I even told them I just quit because I'm not going to fool around with people if you're not going to solve the problem. I mean, what? We haven't solved the problem for 50 years, so we're not going to solve it now. That's how I see where we are, my perspective. And you probably have a different perspective, and maybe you can help us.
I mean, Commissioner, you and I go back a while, and we've had these conversations. There is absolutely no way this problem is going to be solved until SERP is completed. Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan is completed. Senator Negron did an amazing job of getting the EAA reservoir folded into the Central Everglades plan, so that we could basically meet our goals to send that water south. He set aside the state funds to make sure that project happened. It is before, less than a year, it got before Congress for authorization, that amendment for the EAA reservoir. That's never happened in this history. And so that is action. It needs to be funded federally. While Negron and the leadership of the Senate and the governor has put together Legacy Florida to get over $200 million, up to $264 million in investment for this project. This year, the federal government only appropriated $77 million. And so they need to get up over $200 million dedicated funding from the federal government, so that this Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan can get built expeditiously and in our lifetime. Because that's the way to solve this. Solve, managing the water and managing it in the correct way to get it south instead of east and west.
Mr. Bartlett, thank you very much. We appreciate it. Any other questions from my colleagues? No? Seeing none, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Jim.
Enlightening try. Thank you, Commissioner, and I think holding a meeting like this is really critical, especially at Ground Zero here, where we're devastated by what's going on, not just this year, but in years past. I mean, we all recall and I've been here so long and realizing that these algae blooms didn't really start occurring until 2004. And then they started occurring pretty regularly, and of course 2013, 16, and of course this year are really bad years that we see this toxic blue-green algae coming from Lake Okeechobee with the discharges. It's not triggered by septic tanks, it's not created in our estuary, it comes from the lake. And the lake discharges that bring that blue-green algae down, when those cells begin to die off and they give off those toxins, it's really critical. And I think your questions are very pointed that, what is the state doing about it? What is the federal level doing about it? And I think both levels need to be called to task. We need to get on the federal side, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control here. We need to get the EPA and NOAA involved in harmful algal bloom task force, as the representative said. And then on the state level, we need to get the Department of Health involved with the FDEP and other agencies that years ago started to form a harmful algal bloom task force. And it kind of disappeared. And now we need to get that reinvigorated and try to get those focused attention, because it's a health risk. And the Martin Memorial Health Systems in our local community, as you saw, have put up several signs every time in their clinics. They have surveys now in the emergency room, and I understand over 15 cases have been identified for this particular event that are related to these harmful discharges. But as you know, it's not just the algae, it's the discharge itself, it's the bloom, it's all the nutrients in the fresh water itself that damages our estuary. Since June 1st, when they started releases, June 4th, we started to see the algae come through, but all of that discharge that came into our water already had a freshwater estuary since the middle of May. And what happened in the middle of May is we had a lot of local runoff and rains and a lot of local canals discharged. So since the middle of May to now, this estuary has been basically fresh. And that freshwater condition, as you know, as I've reported before, is not healthy for our ecosystem. It's not healthy because of the silt and sediment that's deposited on the bottom of the estuary over our oyster reefs, and our seagrass beds have disappeared. I know you've probably all seen John Whitaker and other photos that have showed you dramatic aerials between 2010 and 12 and 2017. There's basically sandbars left out there inside the inlet where I used to see seagrass as thick as you can walk. You couldn't even walk through it, it's so thick. And those seagrasses, as you know, are sustaining our life in our Indian River Lagoon and St.Lucie Estuary, with over 4,300 different species of plants and animals that are existing here. And those nursery grounds have gone away. And the oyster reefs are dead, because after 28 days of fresh water, they start to die off. Now the oyster reef is still there, and we're going to try to restore those once this event's done, and along with seagrass that we're working on. But it's going to take a long, long time to recover. I always get asked how long is it going to take for this to recover after this event's over? And I hate to keep answering that question, because the estuary is resilient, and it will come back once we stop polluting it, and once we stop this damaging discharge. But how long does it take? Well, it depends on how big a volume and how long a duration it was happening. And as you know, that's just really critical. The lake stands at about 14.3 feet right now. And as you know, the Corps of Engineers every week looks at the issue. They say, where is the lake? And according to the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule, they want to discharge. It was brought up about the schedule. This water control plan that the Corps of Engineers and the district work on, this 2008 Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule, needs to be revised. It was brought up earlier, and fortunately it's on the integrated delivery schedule, which was just provided at the South Florida Ecosystem Task Force. The new integrated delivery schedule calls for that to move up and to start in 2019, next year, rather than 2024, when it was going to wait.
what's in that schedule can already be implemented and done. And I think that the representative brought it up before. Right now, we're getting a pulse release schedule. You've probably seen this pulse release schedule. This is better than a constant release. We're getting at least a couple of days at that schedule out of 7 days, a couple of days with no discharges. It allows that tidal flow to come back in the estuary and the salinity to try to recover. But the salinity still at Roosevelt Bridge are very depressed. They're normally about 20 to 25 parts per thousand. Freshwater 0, the ocean's 35. Those salinities at Roosevelt are down around 9, 10 at the best. And at the surface where the freshwater still is, it's down around 4. So again, the oysters, seagrass, all those communities are really being devastated. Just wanted to mention that they are putting a little water south right now through the S351, 354, and 352 are the 3 outlets south of the lake. And as Commissioner brought up, those don't have a great big capacity compared to the east and west capacity. We wish they did, and we're trying to improve that with this EA reservoir project to increase those capacities. But right now, there's limited. They have started to put some water south. But what's frustrating to me is that prior to this in May, when the rain started coming, the EA basin runoff was allowed to go through our stormwater treatment areas and into the water conservation areas south of there, between there and Tamiami Trail. And it raised that from a 0.5 below schedule to a 1.5 feet above schedule in the water conservation areas. What does that mean? Then when it was time to discharge, there was no capacity. So we drained the Everglades agricultural area, and it stayed down, and those elevations in those canals are at 9.5 feet today. And they were always below 10 feet. And what's interesting is in the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule, they're required to maintain those canals at the optimum levels. And in table 7.1 of this schedule, they're supposed to be at 11.5 to 12 feet elevation. So our question to the district and the Corps is, why aren't we maintaining those canals at a higher level? The optimum level is in the schedule in order to provide more of that water table rise and storage, basically storage of this water south. I just want to end with saying that, you know, the point that was brought up about the representative, and I was out with him at the blocks and saying, we ought to keep pushing this, is keeping that lake lower. When we revised this schedule, or even before, the operations of that water control schedule and the new colonel coming in is somebody we can address on August 17th, is how can we keep that lower? And it's always that dry season when we're trying to keep that water high for water supply. But it can go low. In 2011, it went down to, actually 2001, we had a severe drought. And if you recall, the lake dropped to 8.97 feet elevation. So we bought 14 forward pumps to put in the lake in order to pull water out for water supply. They go down to 7 feet. So if the lake even dropped to 7 feet, they could still pump water out. So the lake went down to 9.5 feet in 2011 at a low point just before the wet season. And of course, we got the wet season, tropical storm, jumped up 3 feet. And it jumped 3 feet from 9.5, so that's only, 12.5 feet. But if it jumped up 3 feet now from 14.3, it would be pretty disastrous at 17 feet. The risk level, as you mentioned, there's a little table the Corps uses. At 15 feet elevation, there's a 1% risk of breach and failure of the dike. 1% at 15 feet. That's what Senator Negron kept bringing up in years past about why are we concerned about this 1% risk? Yes, it's a safety issue, but it's not, 1% is causing a lot of harm if we're trying to keep it below 15 feet. So we're all about improving the dike. We're all about necessarily moving that water south, and we're about storing that water north of the lake too. And I'm glad you brought that up, because the Lake Okeechobee regulation, the watershed project that we just had a public meeting on, is not going to be sufficient enough to store and treat that water north of the lake. As you know, we channelized the Kissimmee. What we did when we restored part of the Kissimmee is shown that the floodplain works well, that it can work well if we restore it. So we need to store and treat that water north. There's 4 times the amount of phosphorus coming into the lake than the total maximum daily load, which was set by the state legislature in year 2000 on the Lake Okeechobee Protection Act. 18 years ago, the state legislature said that TMDL will be met by 2015. And that TMDL said only, instead of 560 metric tons a year coming in now, it's supposed to be 104 metric tons a year at 40 parts per billion in phosphorus. What do we have now? We still have that loading coming in. Despite all the BMPs, all the rhetoric that's gone on, it's not storing and treating that water north. So why do we get algae blooms? We get algae blooms because that water quality coming into the lake and polluting the lake is terrible. So we need to prevent that from coming into the north. This commission can take some really good action. I know you've been looking at remediation and how to do that, but I very much caution you. I mean, this state order from the executive order from the governor definitely gives the leeway between now and between July 9th and September 9th of things that can be done to modify schedules, to change regulations, to make sure things go. But be very cautious about remediation of chemical or biochemical treatments to these algae blooms. We don't need to be treating it. We need to be stopping it at the source of the problem.
Amen.
Mr. Perry, thank you very much, not just for this morning, but for your decades of experience and help. You are a calm voice that, I don't know if I can be so calm anymore. Personally, and what I mean by that is that whatever side of the issue people fall on, agricultural environmentalists, they all look to you and they know that what you say is truthful and it's fair and reasonable, and I personally appreciate it very much. Commissioner Hurd.
Yeah, Mark brings up a very good point. I read the harmful algal bloom task force report this weekend. It was in 1995 or 1999, one or the other.
Right.
That's what the state was doing back then. They were doing the right thing. They were studying these cyanobacteria, ciguatera, all kinds of these toxins, trying to figure out what was happening and trying to figure out the solution. And what happened? What happened? And now, as you say, we didn't really have these algal blooms until 2004, but boy, have we been slammed by them since 2004. And now we need to pay more attention to the science, because they're harming us in ways that we don't know.
And I think when talking to some of the staff there, what happened is that after they met in 1999, all the agencies got together in Tallahassee with DEP. They were all deciding how we can do this. And then leaving that, nobody took the responsibility to continue that on. So it just kind of faded away. And unfortunately, it's unfortunate that a lot of the support for those agencies has also gone away. And what we're seeing is the result is not enough sampling, not enough study on what's going on. It's critical that we understand this, and we depend on our agencies like FDEP and Department of Health and others to get on this and really understand it for a public health and safety issue. But you're right, there was this harmful algal bloom task force studying all the different harmful algal blooms, including red tide. But it should have stayed together, and it should have been well supported and well funded throughout the change in administrations, the change in the legislature. It still should have gone on as a priority, a top priority for our state, and unfortunately it didn't. Yes.
Thank you.
Any more? Yes. Well, thanks again, and I think the representative did a great thing by being at the task force. He kind of walked in. I've been to task force meetings before. It's a lot of great people getting together. A lot of broad interests, as Commissioner Smith said, but what happened at that meeting in Washington, D.C. on the 25th was we had a representative step up to the plate and start really drilling and asking questions. Let's get some action. Let's get some things done. So I'm pleased to hear that he's on the 17th. We're going to get some people here to see the thing firsthand.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brown. Okay,